Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today's video is going to be beginner's negative space painting. So what's negative space? Well, negative space painting is when you paint the negative space around an object. So for example, I've got this little quick drawing of a couple of leaves. So when we do negative space, we are not filling in the normal area, the object area. We are filling in the negative space around it and in between. So for example, when we would do a first base wash layer, a very pale one, and then we would go in with a slightly darker layer and we would paint this area and around here, as opposed to painting inside the shapes that we've drawn. So that is the basic meaning of negative space painting. And the idea is that with negative space, your foreground will really pop to the front and your background will be really dark. So you are going to achieve some real depth with negative space. So I'm going to do this to make it nice and simple with one colour. So it's also going to be a monochrome negative space painting, and that colour is Paynes grey. I'm using a Daniel Smith paint. It's this one here, and I keep a bigger pan of this in my palette because I use this colour a lot, and it's actually Paynes grey blue in Daniel Smith. Most brands do a Paynes grey, Winsor & Newton, Sennelier, Holbein, everybody does sort of, you know, a Paynes grey. So whichever one you have, that's absolutely fine, because the whole thing is going to be done just using that one colour. So I've already mixed my colours in my palette, because we're going to be building this painting obviously on layers. So I have a really pale wash, and then a one step up wash, another step up and another step up, and then I will use pure paint, pure pigment, to fill in the very darkest areas. So let me just show you the values of the colours that I've mixed up so you can see. Let's just give them a good stir again. Right, I'll show you on here. So this is my palest wash. And then that's my next step. And don't forget, of course, watercolour always dries lighter than when it's first applied onto the page. That is my next value, which may not look too different, but it actually is. And especially when you're going on top of layers, it's going to be darker. And then that's my next value. And then we have pure paints. Well, actually my brush is quite wet, so it's retaining a lot of water, so let's get some more. Yeah, pure strength, so really dark. And my advice to you for this is keep clean water. So ideally use 2 jars, one for washing your brush off in and one for having clean water. So let's put that aside. So I'm using my ceramic palette with my mixes in. And then I'm going to be using a wash brush. This is a 1-inch wash brush from Silver, and it's a black velvet 1-inch flat. And then I'm going to be using, as always, my Silver black velvet rounds in a 6, a 4 and a 2. So what else am I going to be using? I'm working on Fabriano Artistico hot press. I'm going to just going to do a small one. This is a 5x7. You can do this on cold press or you can do it on hot press. Choice is entirely yours. I use hot press because it gives me better outlines. So we're going to be doing pebbles. So I want some nice sharp outlines, and I find that hot press gives me that nice crisp detail. So I'm going to mask the area off. So you'll also need some masking tape, because I like a thin, just a little thin border around my paintings. So let's cover it up. I'm not measuring, I'm not being exact. I'm just working by eye here. Just make sure that when you tape off your paper that you really, really press down, because sometimes you think it's stuck and it's not, and it leaks. So even if you think it's done, press it again. And the good thing about this is, because we're working in lots of layers, you can come back to it like later on. So if you haven't got time to paint the whole thing in one go, you can do a layer, leave it to dry, come back to it, do another layer, leave it to dry, come back to it. So it's really, really fun and really simple. So you will also need a HB pencil just to sketch in our shapes as well. So first thing we're going to do is, using the clean water and the wash brush, we're just going to apply water, a glaze, all over the surface. Make sure that the page is saturated but not pooling in anywhere, and not have any dry spots. So I'll show you the sort of look that we're aiming for. I always find that the corners dry out the quickest for some reason. Okay, so you can see the kind of satiny sheen that I have on my paper, and that there's no puddles and that there's no dry spots. So I'm going to go straight in with my very palest mix on that 1-inch wash brush, and I'm just going to lay that down. So I tend to go side to side and up and down to make sure it's nice and even. I have got a little hair on the bottom of my bottom of my paper there, but I'll use some blue tack to get it up in a minute. So the more you fiddle, the more likely it is that things will go wrong. So, right, that is the first layer. Now, you may not think it looks like much, but believe me, it makes a massive difference. Okay, so we'll let that dry. Whether you want to let it dry naturally or whether you want to use a heat tool or a hairdryer to dry that, that's up to you. I'm going to let mine dry naturally and then come back. Right, now that that first layer is dry, we're going to start adding in our, well, sketching in our top pebbles. So these are the pebbles that are going to be sat and popping right at the top of the page. So just using a light hand just to sketch them in. You don't want anything too heavy with the pencil, because the idea is that the pencil mark will disappear once all the layers are on. So we just want a few pebble shapes. like that. Maybe we'll just have a little bit of one peeking in from here. And yeah, we'll have a little bit of one peeking in from there as well. So I hope you can see what I've done there. Let's just bring it closer in case you can't. So I've just got the outline here of a few pebbles. Now, taking the second stage mix, so that's not the lightest, that's the next lightest. I'm going to give that a good stir inside the palette because it's dried out a little bit now. So, and I'm using my bigger brush for this, so my number 6. And I'm going to start filling in the negative space, so the areas around those pebble shapes that I've just drawn. Now you will notice I will turn my page, because when you're trying to get into sort of tight corners and stuff, it's easier to work at different angles to get in there. Don't pressure yourself into keeping your page straight. Turn it as much as you want. So let's zoom you in a little bit more. Okay, and we'll move that pencil. And I'm going to start just here. I'm just using the tip of my brush to follow my lines and create that shape. Let's take a little bit more. And don't worry if your lines aren't perfect, because we can always perfect that later and rectify it. It's no big issue at all. And also don't worry if your wash isn't perfectly smooth, because stones aren't perfectly smooth and they have lots of different variations in them, so that will only add to the appearance of our pebbles. So I tend to use the flat of my brush, the belly, to go around the edge of those shapes. It works quite nicely. But of course, as we get into smaller areas, I then tend to take the brush up onto its tiptoe and use it that way, so I can really get in there. Okay, let's take it back out a little bit. Right, so currently it looks a bit crazy, but let's let that dry and then we'll come back and we'll add the next layer. Right, so we're going to go back to our pencil and we're going to start sketching in, now that this is dry, the next shapes for our pebbles. So you may need to use a slightly heavier hand because we've already got that next layer marked down. And we're going to take the next pebbles underneath some of the first ones so that they look like they're sitting on top of each other. So just add them where you feel that they should be sat. And don't forget to vary the sizes. Some can be bigger and smaller than others. Okay, so I've got my shapes. So now I'm going to go into my third mix and give that a good stir and possibly add a spot more water to it. And starting with the same number 6 round brush, I'm going to again paint in the negative space, leaving the first shapes we did and the new pebble shapes that we've done. So start with my paper turned again. Okay, so again, I'm just going to wait for this layer to dry and then we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so let's move on to the next layer. So now we're going to need sort of an even heavier hand with our pencil, not so as to indent the paper, but a heavier hand. And now when we do our pebbles, I'm going to take them underneath even more pebbles. So these are really sitting down low. I'm hoping that you can see this with the dark, but possibly not. I'll hold it up in a minute. I'm going to have another one there. Another one coming under here. And don't forget to make them flow through so that you've got that shape and it looks like it's sitting underneath. And now with this layer, our negative spaces are going to become smaller. So I'll move down a brush size now and go to my number 4 and possibly down to the number 2 depending on how small the areas gets. There. Okay, let's hold it up, see if you can see. So you can just about see the markings that I've got. Okay. And now you can start to see it pop. So let's again let that dry and then come back and add the final layer of dark. Alright, so now we're going to add in that last very dark layer, and then that will be the layering part finished, and then we can start putting some shadows into our little pebbles. So for the last layer, it's going to be even smaller sections now. So it's just going to be sort of corners. So I'm going to have one there, one here, and just one there. Section there, and that little corner there, there. And even though these are really little bits, they make a massive difference. They really do. They really make it pop. I'm gonna go from here around. Okay, so I'll zoom you in a little bit because these are really little sections. So I'm wetting my smallest brush, my number 2, and I'm just going straight into my little pan of Paynes grey. Got a little hole in it now, so there's a little bit of water in there. And then I'm just going to check on a card to make sure it's the right consistency. So I want it sort of like ink, and that's about perfect. So I don't want it too runny, and I don't want it thick and gloopy. So I'm just going to start adding in those very dark areas. And that's where the tip of the brush and the small size brush comes in very handy. Okay, so I'm going to leave that to thoroughly dry and then we'll come back and start doing some shadows. Right, so let's add some details to these little pebbles and let's just take it in a little bit. Right, so I'm going back to my number 6 now and I'm just going into my plain water and we'll start with this one up the top here. And I'm just going to add a glaze of water, just like we did in the beginning, to the shape of this pebble. So again, just a nice even glaze with a sort of satiny appearance, no puddles or pools, no dry spots. Just a nice even coat. And then I'm going to start with this bottom area because this is the way up of my page, this way. So I'm going to start with this bottom area because I'm going to have the light coming from above. So the shadows of my pebbles will be at the bottom. So just make sure that bottom area is nice and smooth. Now I'm going to dip in to my second mix and I'm going to just dot that and follow the curve of this bottom pebble, tapering it off as I reach the corner, and it's sort of slightly thicker down at this very bottom area. And the way that the paint spreads and makes these little fingers and patterns is great because it's all aiding in how a rock or a pebble would look. They have these lovely little irregularities in them. So leave that to spread, let it do its thing. Now I'm just going to dip into the next mix and very lightly dot that right at the bottom edge. Very lightly. And again, let that spread in, do its thing. And just create that shadow. If you want to go even darker, just along this very bottom edge here, I just add a little touch of my darker mix and just let it blend like that. And then I'm going to wash my brush off, go back to that second mix, and I'm going to add in, while it's still wet, some little sort of dots and squiggles just to give the stone some texture. Add a bit of the next darker mix and drop some of those in as well, where the pebbles would maybe be dented and there's darker recesses in those holes. And then I've got a little bit of a splodgy bit there, so I'm just tapping that away like that. And already that's given so much more shape to our pebble, so it doesn't just look like this flat white floating thing. It's actually got some form now. So I'll do another one. And go for this middle one here. And there we go, nice even coat. And again into that second mix and start pulling it along to create the shadow. And as we did with the above, try to taper it out at each edge. And then again, slightly darker. I've got a little bit that wasn't wet there, so I'm just tapping at it with some water to blend it in. And again, we're going to add some little bits of interest. I've got a bit too much on my brush there, so. And you can go in with all the different mixes of this to add varying marks, varying strengths. Take a little bit of the darker again and just hit that bottom section there where the shadow would be the deepest, like that. There we go. So I'll play you some music while I continue doing these and speed it up a little bit, and then we'll go on to the next ones. Right, so we can see that we've got some good form going on now on those top pebbles. So we're going to do the same sort of thing to the pebbles underneath. Now, with the pebbles underneath, obviously we're going to have to go slightly darker because otherwise we won't get shadows. And the other thing to be aware of is that when we're looking at those pebbles, we're going to have 2 areas of shade now, or maybe 3, maybe 4. But we're going to have the area of shade here where this pebble is sat on top, and my wash has actually given me its own shadow, the wash that I applied earlier, so that's quite interesting. We're going to have an area of shade around here where this pebble is sat on top, and we're also going to have the general area of shade down the bottom that gives the pebble its form. So let's start with this one. So I'm going to apply water again, just like we did to the others. But because we've got a colour underneath, I'm trying to do it very lightly and not disturb any of that wash. I mean, it shouldn't disturb any, but I just like to try and protect everything. So if you start scrubbing at it, it may well. And we can always add more water as we need it. Right, so there's the glaze. Now I'm not going to be using the first mixture that I made up, the lightest mixture, and we'll start with the second mixture and see how we get on, and just get it right into those little crevices there. Then we're going to bring it around here. And take it along this edge. And taper it off. Just going to rinse my brush and taper it off as it comes around this corner. Now I'm going to go slightly darker and tap that in and down the edge, just as we did on the other pebbles. It's just bearing in mind we have more areas of shade than we did with the first. And then I'm just going to quickly reglaze this area. I'm going to grab a tiny bit of my darker mix and add tiny bits just to the very darkest corners and the edges. I mean, you're letting the paint do the work for you, to be honest. And that's the beauty of this, is that don't have to really control it. You can just let it do its thing. Going back into that lightest mix and just adding some areas of interest. Just as we did before. Like that. And so I will continue doing our lightest stones and then come back and we'll do the next layer. Okay, so we're getting to the darker areas now, and I've got even more areas of shade to look for. So obviously I'm going to be going into the darker mixes because the lighter ones aren't going to show up here now. So let's add the glaze. being mindful of those edges and those little corners. Okay, and now I shall dip in to the darker mix, and I've gone down to a size 4 brush now. I may even go down to a size 2 in a minute, depends how tight those little corners are. So because I've gone with my darkest mix, when it comes to adding the sort of very dark edges, I shall be dipping straight into the pan then. So at some point when we get down to the next darker layer, they will blur in with the sort of dark black shadow areas where there's nothing really there. And I'll fade away into those. And if you need to refine any of your edges, do that as you go along. Need a bit more water, as that area seems to be drying out. And I'm going to dip in to my pan and hit those little cracks and corners with the very darkest. Turn the page. I'm just going to take a little bit of my lighter mix and apply it around here, just to aid in blending that very dark, and just tap it in. Like so. And then of course I'll add a couple of the darker dots. And there's that one done. So again, I'll go and do that to the rest of them. I won't make you watch the whole thing this time. It might get rather boring and repetitive, but I'll go ahead and do the rest of that colour stone, and then we'll move on to the really dark ones. Right, so with that section done, there is only the last couple of darkest ones left to do now. So I'm going to move down to my little brush. Number 2. I think I'm going to zoom in a bit closer because I can't really judge how dark this is and what you can and can't see. So let's go up here. So again, just adding that glaze, that watery glaze, and watching those edges. And I'm going straight in to my pan to pick up, and I'm following the outline of the rocks around it and the edges of the stone itself, so that this falls away into the shadows. That is the idea. I'm just going to take a little bit of the lighter mix just to blend it with, so it's not a harsh line. And if at any time you feel you've got too much of anything, you can always dampen your brush, wipe it on a piece of, wash your brush, wipe it on a piece of kitchen roll so that it's dry, and use your brush as a mop to mop up any areas where you think there's just too much going on there. I'm just tapping that around, and now back into the strong pigment. And I've got to turn around to do this bit, like that, and following the lines of the stones. And again, back into some of that lighter mix just to blend and give no harsh lines. Just like that. And if you feel you want to go darker anywhere, so I feel like I want a bit more depth up here, you can always add a bit more in and just tap away and diffuse those edges. And there we go, that's our very deepest stone. So I'll go ahead and just finish the last few of those, and then this painting will be complete. Right, so that is my final layer, totally complete. Now at this point, if you wanted to, you could go on and just refine your edges if you found that you needed to. I'm pretty pleased with that, so I'm just going to leave it as it is instead of messing. So we'll get the tape off. And I'll do it rather gently today, even though this tape does not normally rip the paper. It's a good one, this one. And let's do it carefully, just to make sure. The reason that I love this thin edge as opposed to a thick edge is because it always reminds me more of a photo when you reveal it. And there we go, that's what the finished painting looks like. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I know I enjoyed making it, and if you have any feedback, questions, comments, then please leave them in the description box below. And if you did enjoy this video, then please, as always, like and subscribe. And if you want to be notified every time I upload a video, then hit that little bell button, and that lets me know that you like my videos and you want me to continue making them. So thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, bye.